everyone. My name is Amanda Yergi, and I am a candidate for a Master of Education in Childhood 1 through 6 and special education at Roberts Wesleyan College. Today, I'm going to be presenting my master's thesis on the effect of social skills instruction on students with emotional and behavioral disorders. So a little bit of an introduction. What is an emotional and behavioral disorder? It's kind of a term that's been thrown out there very frequently, especially in recent years, but a lot of people don't really understand what it is and what it kind of entails. So an emotional and behavioral disorder is really an umbrella term that can refer to a variety of different conditions or disorders. Emotional and behavioral disorders have really, the term for it or the definition of it has really changed a lot over time. But in the 1980s, the National Mental Health and Special Education Coalition came together and proposed the most recent definition, which we still hold true today. They basically have these three criteria. It has to be more than just a temporary response to a stressful event in the environment, and that it has to be exhibited or displayed in multiple settings. So not just one specific setting, not just in the home, not just in the school, not just in the community, but it has to be a couple different settings. In this disorder, or these symptoms have to be pretty prevalent, and they have to keep occurring or keep being displayed despite any kind of interventions that might have been tried with the student. Some common examples of emotional behavioral disorders are oppositional defiant disorder, autism spectrum disorder, schizophrenia, depression, ADHD, bipolar disorder, emotional disturbance, conduct disorders, anxiety disorders is on there as well. The list really goes on. This is a very big umbrella term in which a lot of different conditions and disorders come underneath that. What are social skills? So basically, a social skill is a really broad term, and it can describe two different processes in the realm of social emotional development. The first is interacting and communicating with another person. So is the person able to make eye contact, use a positive tone of voice, interrupt somebody appropriately, solve problems, things in that nature. How do they communicate or interact with another person? And this can be nonverbal and verbal processes. The second part of a social skill is a child or a person's ability to self-regulate after becoming triggered by a negative event or a negative emotion. So this is very subjective. Two children might witness the same event. So let's say they witness a school shooting. One person might perceive that as particularly stressful, whereas the other person might, think it's stressful, but not necessarily to the point where they're not able to self-regulate or to cope with the situation. So this is completely subjective to the person themselves. What is social skills instruction? Social skills instruction has a lot of names in the literature. It can be social skills intervention, social skills training, social skills program, but in general, it's really any program that surrounds the education of social skills. So teaching how to solve conflict, how to, appropriately interrupt someone, how to make eye contact, how to take on the perspectives of other people, anything that surrounds that education. There's different types and the mode of instruction for social skills. For the purpose of this current research, I devised 4 different categories. So explicit instruction, is the person able, is the instruction directly taught as if in the other subjects, math, science, social studies, ELA? Is it taught in the same way? There's somebody in the front of the room, it's a formal lesson plan. Is it peer mediated? So does it involve peers of the same age aiding in that education or providing that reinforcement to engage in those social skills? We've also got electronic programming. So is this education involving electronic devices? So a TV, a tablet, a smartphone, anything along that nature. Or is it blended and combined? So are there multiple methods or multiple modes of this instruction being combined together and seeing if it's effective that way? My motivation and purpose for research. So I currently work as a special education teacher for elementary and middle school students with emotional and behavioral disorders, and they have a trauma background. So my students actually receive social skills instruction at least one time a week through a formal instruction. The teaching assistants facilitate this, so they will plan out a lesson and kind of carry it out as if it were one of the the main content area subjects, but there's so much more that they get from social skills that aren't planned. So I like to say that, they're receiving social skills instruction all day, every day, because they really are. Anytime the situation arises, if they're having a conflict with another peer during activity or recess time, that's a perfect opportunity to provide that social skills instruction or that social skills training or education surrounding that. Another reason why I really wanted to conduct this research is because of the impact of the COVID-19 pandemic on all students, but especially those with emotional and behavioral disorders. This pandemic has caused such a mental health crisis for all individuals, but especially for those that were already at a disadvantage in the realm of social skills and self-regulating to stressors. So effective social skills training is absolutely necessary to intervene on the social emotional impact that the pandemic has essentially created. The purpose of my research was really to determine the importance of teaching these social skills to students with emotional and behavioral disorders and really investigate the effectiveness of social skills training. How, is there different methods that can be used to teach those social skills? Are there different methods that are more effective than one another? I also really wanted to look into the length of the programming. Does it really matter if you're teaching for 4 weeks, or does it matter if you're teaching for 4 months? Do you need to teach a certain skill for a certain amount of time in order for it to be effective? Some of my research questions, I had 4 main research questions, and the second research question actually had 2 sub-questions. So the first one is there a social skill that, when focused upon with social skills training, demonstrates the most reliable improvement in social emotional functioning? So basically from this, is there a certain social skill, like a specific one? So conflict resolution, perspective taking, appropriately interrupting, one specific social skill that when you use different types of social skills training, so that could be the explicit instruction, the peer mediation, the electronic programming, or the combined methods, are there certain skills that are easier to teach than others? Second research question is, which social skills training mode of instruction is the most effective? So regardless of the type of social skill, is explicit instruction most effective in, improving various social skills when compared to peer mediation, electronic programming, or blended and combined? The first sub question is, do different types of social skills require different modes of instruction in order to be effective? So for example, does anger management have to be taught through explicit instruction in order to be effective? Does perspective taken have to be taught through peer mediation in order to be effective? The second sub-question is, do different age groups, so elementary, middle, high school, require different types of social skills training in order for the intervention to be effective? Do elementary age students have to, be taught through explicit instruction in order for their social skills to be improved? Do high school students have to participate in electronic programming in order for the intervention to be effective? Do certain types of social skills have a targeted age group that would most benefit from the instruction? So for example, if we talked about conflict resolution, is there a certain age group that you have to wait until the child is that age in order for the intervention to be effective? So if we think about anger management, can children of all age be exposed to an intervention that targets the social skills, or do you have to wait until a certain age, such as middle school or high school, in order to expose children to this type of intervention for it to be effective? How does the length of programming impact student outcomes? Does the intervention have to be a certain time frame in order for it to be effective? Does it need to be at least a month long, or maybe it only has to be 2 weeks? Does length of programming matter? There was 2 main theories that were the foundation of this research. The first being Albert Bandura's social learning theory, which was posed in 1977. This basically suggested that all human behavior is learned through observation, modeling, and practice. So in other words, you're not born with all of the skills that you have. You're not born with social skills. You have to learn them. And this is through that observation, modeling, and actually practicing the skills. Children need to be taught by an older, wiser member of society in order to actually learn those social skills. The second theory that kind of was the foundation of this research was Leyvayevsky's sociocultural theory in 1986. Very similar to Bandura, Vygotsky basically said that human development and learning is a social process. This occurs when the youth or the child interacts with that older member of society who can actually provide that learning and that teaching. Children are naturally drawn to learning and new experiences, but they're also heavily influenced by the social and cultural context in which they live. So access to this type of learning is very different from culture to culture. These theories are very, very similar. The one key difference is that Leyvayevsky's sociocultural theory basically acknowledges the social and cultural impacts on learning. Literature review. In general, the literature is very diverse in terms of the type of social skills training, the length of the programming, and other factors. And it's really laid the foundation for current research to really examine what works and what does not. So as I mentioned before, I separated previous literature studies into 4 main categories. Prior research on electronic programming found clear benefits for children with EBDs. So basically decrease in the disciplinary and aggressive behaviors. They found improvement on-task behavior, conflict resolution, and cooperation. So some clear benefit to that intervention. Analysis of the peer-mediated social skills instruction demonstrates the importance of using peers to aid in that social development of students with EBDs. There were some studies that didn't produce significant results, but this really just highlights an important benefit to using peer-mediated social skills instruction is that you're doing this in a natural setting. So you can do this during free time. You can do this during a playground or competitive play. And just using typically developing peers to provide that instruction or that reinforcement. It doesn't feel so forced, it feels pretty natural. Some more studies. Morgan conducted a study in 2012, examined the effectiveness of online and internet social skills for 11 to 18-year-olds with EBDs. This didn't really produce significant results, but it brought up a new area in the research, and this really just highlighted a need for further research in this area. Traditionally, there hasn't been a lot of research on online and internet social skills. It's kind of a new concept due to the advancement of technology in recent years, but this is definitely highlighting a need for that future research. Few studies have really examined the blended or combined methods. A lot of studies will just focus on one specific method rather than a couple of them. But for the studies that were conducted that had combined methods, it showed a decrease in disruptive behavior, an increase in engagement in the classroom, as well as improvement in grades and academic performance. The current research was a 90-minute professional development seminar presented in person on May 14th, 2021, using Keynote software. So this was presented to 18 professionals at the Sotis Junior Senior High School. Some materials that were used were a smartboard, a projector, computer, internet access, and small materials. There was 3 different simulation activities that I conducted. The first one had a sheet with some hard to read text on it, and this was basically meant to mimic how individuals with dyslexia see. The second simulation had a hand clapper toy, so a sheet with a question on it for their partners. They were just having a discussion about this, and the hand clapper toy was meant to be a distraction. Simulation 3, there was a blindfold, miniature marshmallows, and uncooked spaghetti noodles. Basically, people had to create spaghetti towers with these spaghetti noodles and marshmallows, but the key was so they were in groups of 5 and one member was blindfolded and they were the only ones that were allowed to touch the materials. So all of the other people had to instruct the person that was blindfolded on picking up the materials, trying to build it while blindfolded. Evaluation. I separated my participants into 4 different groups, group A through D, and then I'll kind of go into detail about how each group kind of felt about the presentation. For the outside evaluations, I separated my 17 participants into 4 groups, group A through D, and I'll kind of go into detail about the specific strengths that they noted, as well as the recommendations for each individual group. Group A consisted of 4 participants working in the education fields for 20 to 30 years, so this was definitely the most experienced group out of the 4. They noted that the simulation activities were the most enjoyable parts of the presentation because they were entertaining and really mimicked the social struggles of children with EBDs, kind of allowed them to step into the shoes of a child with an emotional and behavioral disorder and kind of experience what they experience on a daily basis. They really thought that the presentation was broken down into easy to understand concepts and really appreciated the specific terminology being thoroughly explained. A couple of the recommendations that they had were that the history portion of the emotional behavioral disorders should probably be shortened so it can leave more time for different aspects of the presentation. And they also said that they recommended more visual components such as videos or other interactive activities to be incorporated. Group B consisted of 4 participants working as one-to-one aides for 2 to 7 years. They really enjoyed the simulation activities, very similar to Group A. They said they were highly interactive, engaging, and informative. Some recommendations that they had is to break up the simulations to be presented throughout the presentation so that it doesn't feel too lecture heavy in some parts and too hands-on in another. Group C consists of 4 participants that work in education and are parents. They actually have a unique perspective because they do have children in school right now, whereas some of the other participants did not. They really enjoyed the simulation activities similar to Group A and Group B. One participant actually noted that Simulation 3 was particularly interesting and entertaining. This was the spaghetti and marshmallow tower. They also enjoyed that the presenter included anecdotes and moments of laughter and said that this was particularly helpful because they could apply these concepts to real-world examples. Some recommendations were just adding blank lines and sheets to the printed version of the PowerPoint so that they could actually take notes during the presentation, and just having a longer time frame so that we could get through all of the information that they wanted to get through and ask questions. Group D consists of 5 participants that work as teaching assistants but didn't really provide a whole lot of detail about their experiences or their expertise in education. As with the other groups, they said that the simulation activities were the most enjoyable. It got people up and moving and really helped them step into the shoes of those children with EBDs. They also said that the presenter spoke clearly and knew the subject in detail, and that the presentation was very explicit and very detailed. Some recommendations is just look over the presentation slides a little bit more for spelling errors and information that might differ from the printed version due to some last minute adjustments and changes after already printing the presentation. They also recommended to kind of just improve time management. The presentation did go over the allotted time, so there were some concepts and some discussions that we didn't really get to, and just providing more examples. Just kind of to sum everything up, the 3 main areas of improvement, as noted by my participants, was time management, the number and type of examples that were provided, and just prioritizing topics. So giving more emphasis to some topics and less emphasis to others. One major area of improvement that wasn't really noted in my participants' evaluation is that the delivery and the explanation of the topic itself needs to just be a little revised. A lot of the participants that I had understood the topic as an opportunity to basically bring personal issues and examples of experiences with children with EBDs, and they thought they were going to gain tips and strategies on how to actually work with these students and how to educate these students. They wanted recommendations, solutions on how to respond, and basically just how to educate students with emotional behavioral disorders, whereas my presentation was supposed to focus on the implementation of social skills training for students with EBDs rather than just students with EBDs in general. So in the future, I will definitely include a brief explanation of the nature of the presentation, as it's really intended to focus on that social skills training, not just students with emotional behavioral disorders in general. The purpose of my research was really just to examine the literature and determine the impact of various models of social skills training for students with EBDs. So I looked into explicit instruction, I looked into peer mediation, electronic programming, blended and combined, and I really tried to find what was the most effective practice. I work with students with emotional behavioral disorders that have these social skill deficits. I wanted to see if there was a type of instruction that was the most effective. In general, there was a lot of mixed results found in the literature, but the current research really highlights the importance of this foundation that the previous literature has set, and it identifies potential gaps in the understanding of our research and really outlines future steps to be taken in the field. Current research really emphasized the importance of providing this social skills instruction for students with EBDs to decrease those social skill deficits and improve that social emotional functioning. How can we apply this to our own practice? Well, Copeland et al. In 2011 found that 61% of people meet the criteria for an emotional behavioral disorder at least once in their lifetime. This is a very high number. This cumulative prevalence is very, very high, which means that the chances of a teacher coming across a child with an emotional behavioral disorder is probably pretty high. And this is important because when teachers understand what emotional behavioral disorders are and how students with these disorders present themselves in the classroom and what challenges they have, they can brainstorm ideas, they can brainstorm solutions to actually support these individuals in the classroom. One of the main takeaways for my presentation and for my research is that social skills training isn't something that needs to be extra or something overly difficult to incorporate into a teacher's or a classroom's overly busy schedule. It just seems daunting to add another thing in. But if there's one thing that I can take away or give the audience or my participants is that it doesn't have to be something extra. You can implement it to your already busy schedule. It doesn't have to be in its own little block. It can be included in ELA. It can be included in math. It can be included at lunchtime. It doesn't have to be its own subject. It can occur during those planned and unplanned times. It can occur in a formal way or an informal way. Social skills training is just trying to improve the social skills of students. If you're on the playground and two students are having a conflict, that's a time to step in and provide that education surrounding social skills and facilitating them trying to participate in conflict resolution. My biggest takeaway is use every opportunity as a learning experience. If I can recall the amount of times that I have had to teach social skills or do an intervention for my students, I would say 90% of the time, it happens during unplanned times. Limitations in future research. The current research was conducted during the COVID-19 pandemic, which really restricted the number of people that could gather in the same location, even for educational purposes. There were still guidelines and restrictions that we had to follow. So the number of participants was not at its optimal level. In addition, many of the individuals probably already received their 100-hour CTLE requirement during that 4-month quarantine period, which could have also impacted the participation. There were some technology challenges, including the lack of internet access and an inability to play a video for the audience. The length of the presentation was confined to just 90 minutes. The researcher, myself, having a narrow network of connections was definitely a limitation, just because my participants were all from Sodus Junior Senior High School, so that can actually contribute to some bias in responses and overall takeaway from the presentation just because they're from the same area. Future research, I've gone over this a few times throughout the presentation, but it's really needed to further examine the effectiveness of social skills training for children with EBDs. Many studies have really contributed to the diversity of social skills training methodology, so there's various different ways that you can implement this, but very few studies have actually examined the use of the same methodology for comparison. So it's very difficult for current research to really analyze which mode of social skills training is most effective, because there really hasn't been enough comparison or the use of the same methodology that you could even use for comparison. There's been so many different methods that people have used that you can't really compare them because they're not the same. Future research should really examine which mode of social skills training is most effective in improving social emotional functioning. Does the length of programming matter? And is there really a targeted age group for certain skills? In general, the probability of a teacher having a student with emotional behavioral disorder is very high, considering this high cumulative prevalence of emotional behavioral disorders. So the use of these effective interventions that address social skill deficits and seek to improve the social emotional functioning of students is very important. And it's never been more important. But simply agreeing to educate about social skills really is not enough. You can't just say, oh, well, I'm going to do this and this. We really need to be using empirically based interventions that have significant results. You know, you could say, well, I taught anger management doing this method. But if there's no research or no substantial evidence to really back that up and saying that it's effective in teaching that social skill, then what is the point? So we really need to be using these empirically based interventions, but we can't really do that until the future research is needed to determine the best practice for social skills education. And that concludes my presentation on the effect of social skills training on students with emotional and behavioral disorders. Here are all my references, and thank you so much for listening to my presentation.